Well, hi everyone. Ken Ham, CEO of Answers in Genesis, Creation Museum, and the Ark Encounter, and I'm with one of our staff members, one of our researchers, speakers, writers, Dr. Nathaniel Jensen, has a PhD from Harvard University. We're continuing this series on the new history of the world. Well, it's not new from a biblical perspective, but it is new from a perspective of what most people have been taught. And this is the new, if you like, history of the human race compared to what most people have been taught. But really, it's showing that research confirms biblical history. Now, episode 17, what happened to the Vikings? Dr. Jensen, this is going to be interesting. And episode 18, which will be tomorrow night, can we identify the Jews genetically? Wow, this is going to be really interesting. But for this episode, fearsome, violent, romanticized, to this day, the Vikings of the Middle Ages command our attention. Even children's movies have taken up the Viking banner. So what do we know about their history? The legacy of their exploits. After the Vikings plundered Northern Europe, what happened to them? 1,000 years after the peak of their power, do any of their descendants roam Europe? What about the Americas? Could you be related to the Vikings? Well, let's find out. Dr. Jensen, take it away.
So in this episode, we want to know, is it me or is it Ken who's a Viking, or neither of us? Or could it be some of our viewers? These are the questions we want to try to address. And of course, a part of the larger question of who do we come from? And what makes this series so new is we're using genetics to try to unravel the connections among us. I look at this slide each week, I open with this, and I feel like even my own perspective on all this has changed as we've gone along. And looking at the static view of today masks so much of the complexity that's come before, and I find this all fascinating. And the complexity, of course, involves our relationship to the ancient cultures as well, and my preconceived notions about our relationships are changing. I've promised a number of major conclusions that we'll reach along the way, and some of them we've already seen. We've seen that most Europeans are of recent Asian ancestry. You don't see the nationalities for very long in the family tree. We're using the male inherited DNA, the Y chromosome, to understand who's related to whom, how closely or distantly Ken and I are related, how closely and distantly all of us are related. We're going to eventually see that so-called black-white people exist, Caucasians who've had dark-skinned ancestors in their family tree and don't even know it. We've seen that the Americas were resettled at least once before Columbus. And in the next week or two, we're going to look at some of the most ancient history. Neanderthals, who do they come from? What's their story? They're always cast as primitive. What is their place in history and their relationship to us? And my goal in all this is partially apologetic. So if you're a creationist watching, you'd have new tools to defend your faith. If you're a non-creationist watching, that this would challenge what you hold to be true. But for all groups, that we marvel at our own stories, the stories of those we love, at the history of the human race in a way we've never marveled at before. If you were living on the northern European coast during the Middle Ages and you saw a ship like this approaching the shore, you'd probably be terrified. These Vikings have a well-established reputation, had a well-established reputation back then, and were well known for their brutality, their violence, their plundering, and that reputation continues to this day. Yet despite all that, we've made movies like How to Train Your Dragon, and even children's books are some of the most popular topics involve these Viking peoples. So who were they? What's their story? And on the romantic side, could any of us be related to them? Are there people walking around today who have Vikings in their heritage? Just because this is now late in our series, episode 17, I'm going to do the review very quickly. We've seen episode 1 that the world is smaller than we think. We're going to see this with this Viking story as well. Episode 2 that our family trees are more connected than we think. Doing the math of that family tree calculation, we've seen that racial change can happen much more quickly than we think. So are the Vikings today Caucasian peoples if they have descendants? We've seen the dramatic consequences of the genetics of racial change at the and combined with reproductive data in episode 4. Episodes 5 and 6 really are the foundation for this entire discussion we've been having, because it shows that the Y chromosome DNA is inherited very quickly, and the Y chromosome clock, the rate at which the Y chromosome DNA sequence changes from generation to generation, fits exactly what the Bible says about the timescale for humanity. The number of DNA differences among all of us today go back just a few thousand years. And we can use the fact that the paternally inherited DNA, the Y chromosome, gets passed on imperfectly as a clock. We can use the number of Y chromosome differences to establish genealogical relationships, so that if Ken and I have very few DNA differences at the Y chromosome level between us, we must have a recent common ancestor. Whereas if we have many Y chromosome differences between us, we must have a distant common ancestor. And you apply that principle around the globe, you can reconstruct the family tree, the history of humanity from it. And this then represents the key to human history that we've been using as the basis to explore relationships around the globe. Episode 7 was looking for lost relatives of Europe. We found them in India. And we saw in episode 8 that the explanation has to do with the Mongol conquest and the aftermath of it. Episode 9 looked at a Chinese connection to Eastern Europe. Episode 10 looked at Western Europe, which is really a lot of the history of the Americas, because so many of the Caucasian Americans trace their ancestry to Western Europe. That hidden history shows that most Western Europeans, Americans, episode 10 goes back to Central Asia. Episode 11, we began to look at the pre-Columbian history, before the Europeans arrived. And so on episode 11, even in mainstream science, there's a dramatic revolution that's rewriting many of the stereotypes we've taken for granted and that are now shown to be wrong. Episode 12 was really a bombshell, looking at how genetics shows that today's Native Americans were not the first Americans. And this caused us, episode 13, to take a new look at the Native American oral histories, and we found profound parallels between what they've said is their history and what genetics is revealing. Episode 14, we looked at the implications for some of the archaeological history that's been discovered and how this new genetic discovery could impact the demise of civilizations like the Maya and give us new explanations, new tools. Episode 15, we saw a connection between Native America and Europe that's found in Central Asia, because both peoples come from that place. Episode 16, we looked at the first Americans and saw there could be some connection to the early Pacific peoples, the Australian Aborigines, and promised that perhaps there might be a way in the future to figure out who exactly these first Americans were. Well, today we want to look at who the Vikings were and what happened to them. Stereotypically, we view them as tall, burly, red-headed, blonde, Scandinavian-looking peoples. Is that true? Well, a contemporary of them, about 1,000 years ago, a Muslim who was going in that direction in Russia, said he saw the Swedes, and some of the Vikings were Swedes, when they landed and camped beside the Volga, Volga being one of the rivers in Russia, which we'll look at in the map in a moment. I never saw statelier men. They are as tall as palm trees, ruddy-cheeked and with red hair. So it appears that some of the stereotypes we've had fit what people documented at that time. Their homeland, of course, was in Scandinavia, shown here in green. The Volga River is over here in Russia. Why would a Muslim be encountering these people around the Volga River and giving us descriptions? Well, at the time they were ruling, 700s to 900s AD, was contemporary with the Muslim conquests of Muhammad and his descendants. And you can see that part of the geographic reach of their kingdoms came up here to the edge of modern-day Russia. So the Volga is right around here. It's not that far. There's not much distance then between the voyages, the exploits of the Vikings and of the Muslims at that time in history. It wasn't just the Volga, though. You can see it shaded here in green. Again, their homeland is Scandinavia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, so forth. They made voyages and settled Iceland. Of course, they also made it eventually over to the Americas, but not permanently, as far as we know. They famously plundered the British Isles, the northern coast of Europe, France and such, Normandy. They made their way into Russia. Russia was settled by Vikings. And you can see by these blue lines, they were all over Europe, even eventually becoming mercenaries for the Byzantine Empire. The Varangian Guard was Viking in origin. So if these people ruled Europe, history tells us they did, and if they left descendants to this day, what would be the genetic evidence of that? How would we know if some of us today have them in our family tree? Well, let's go to this study that we've been looking at frequently in our episodes together. This is the 1,000 Genomes Project that sampled peoples around the globe. Not all the geographical extent, but they sampled the major places of where the people are. So India, China, Western Africa, Europe, parts of the Americas are population centers, places where people are heavily concentrated. And we've been able to take the Y chromosomes from these people, reconstruct the family history, and explore the implications of it. So what sort of genetic signature should we look for if the Vikings have left descendants to this day? Well, let's take their history forward. They begin to settle in those parts of the map that we just looked at the end of the Dark Ages of Europe, 900s. What happened in Europe afterwards? Are there any genetic signatures that should lie outside of Europe that could be of Viking origin? Did any Europeans leave Europe thereafter? Well, one of the major incursions outside of Europe following the Viking era were the Crusades, movements of European peoples into the Middle East. This is about the 1200s AD. These movements, though, weren't permanent. They tried to retake Jerusalem, and there was a back and forth, and the Muslim armies eventually drove them out. So there isn't much to speak of there. We wouldn't necessarily expect much of a genetic signature in the Middle East because of these events. We looked at the implications for the Russian conquests. So this is movement from Moscow, Europe, I should say Eastern Europe, pushing further east than into Asia, with the dates of the Russian expansion shown here on the map. So if there's Vikings in Russia, we might expect to see these signatures moving eastward. Then, of course, famously by the 1500s, 1600s begins the age of exploration in Europe, of expansion, with many of these major European powers seeking to colonize the globe. The Spanish and Portuguese heavily in the Americas, France, England, elsewhere in the globe. And of course, we've talked about the phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire, being a descriptive rule of thumb at the height of the power of the British Empire. So if we're looking at the signature of the Vikings today, and looking at what happened in Europe after the Viking era, we say we should be looking for a signature of peoples who are in Europe, and primarily only in Europe for about 500 years after the Viking era, and then eventually they spread to the Americas, if we're talking Spain, France, England, during the age of exploration. Yes, there were expansions into Africa, but rarely permanent ones, South Africa being an exception, where you still have Caucasian descent peoples, European descent peoples there to this day. But what else happened in Europe that could give us some clues to identifying the smoking gun, so to speak, of their existence, and clues to their fate? Well, let's broaden our look at Europe beyond just the indigenous Europeans, because that's what I'm going to call the Vikings for the moment, indigenous from the 700s onward. We've talked in previous episodes about the steady flow of Central Asian peoples into Europe, some of them being contemporary with and then post-dating the conquests of the Vikings in Europe. So you can see the dates here for many of these Central Asian groups. Of course, we've talked about the Mongol incursions into Europe about the 1200s, which is several centuries after the Vikings, and the signatures of that. And together, all of these Central Asian movements have contributed over around 2/3 of the genetic ancestry, the male genetic ancestry of Europe today. And of course, because Europe is a dominant influence in the Americas, heavy influence there as well. So this is the history then that can guide our genetic exploration. We're looking for a signature that's localized to Europe from 700, 900 onwards, before the age of exploration. Then this leads to some sort of echo in the Americas, because Europeans go to the Americas. But we're also going to see, given what we've already explored, there's going to be a heavy Central Asian influence independent of this. And so this might mean that whatever signature we're looking for is likely going to be a minority of the European lineages today. So there's our smoking guns. We're looking for something localized to Europe, spreads to the Americas, pretty much only in Europe, not elsewhere in the globe, because we don't see much in the way of European expansion until the very recent era, the colonial era. And this is probably going to be a minority of the lineages in Europe. What about the other side of the equation? We've looked at what happens after the Vikings. Are there any clues that could tell us who they came from? The pre-Viking history that could tell us other clues that might give us some hints. Well, prior to the Vikings, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of the sequence of historical events is the fall of the Roman Empire. So if the Vikings are about 700, 500 is when the Western Roman Empire falls to the so-called Germanic tribes, some of the Central Asians. I used to think it was primarily Central Asians, and the Huns would fit that description. They came in and then basically left. But these other tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Angles, the Saxons. I'm not convinced these were necessarily Central Asian in origin. The Goths, for example, claim that they have Scandinavian ancestry. So these peoples may be indigenous Europeans as well. And so they would be in Europe prior to the Vikings, and they would share the same post-Viking European history. They're in Europe, and so if we're looking for their signature, again, it's likely to have little evidence in the Middle East, because even though the Crusaders came in, they were kicked back out. If anything, they might have some signature in the modern Russian principalities, and they may have some signatures in the major colonial territories where there was more permanent residence, the Americas being the major example. So the only thing that changes in the clues that we're looking for is the total time scale. So the Roman Empire falls in 400s or 500s, and so for the 1500 years thereafter, there's a heavy localized European signature with little outside of it. So when we're looking for the Viking signature, we're probably also going to see the signature of some of these Germanic and perhaps other Scandinavian peoples like the Goths. So let's go back to this study and look at the European lineages. One of the ones that immediately suggests itself as a candidate is a lineage, a group that we have not discussed before. This is group I. We've not discussed it in any detail. You can see from the colors already, it's mainly this gold and gray, basically Europe and the Americas. It seems to be something that fits. So just so you can see here who we're talking about, you've got British, Italians, Peruvians, and again, because this isn't a cluster of heavy Europeans, my expectation is, and my explanation at this point is all of these gray lineages are likely peoples of European descent. We've already seen in previous episodes that because of the major population collapse in the Americas, the male lineages in Latin America are heavily European. There's African influence, and only a small minority, about 20% of the Latin American lineages today look like they're the indigenous Native Americans. And when I say indigenous, I mean the ones that came over from Central Asia in the early AD era. So there you have it. There's Finnish, there's British. You can see again, just same song, second verse for this entire grouping. So that seems to check a box for this smoking gun that we're looking for. It's localized to Europe and the Americas. That fits fine. If you look at the depth of these lineages, so this one up here fits the history of population growth that we've discussed. It's this long, flat line with a bunch of expansion in the recent past. Again, we've talked about around the globe and in Europe, the shape of human population growth is a hockey stick shape, where it's this gradual growth of peoples, and boom, in the last few hundred years, it shoots upward. This particular branch of I fits that. These other ones are consistent with the overall picture, and they have a deep branching lineage, and that's significant because what it means is you have indigenous European peoples prior to the arrival of the Central Asians. And again, if we're looking for the signature of Vikings and perhaps some of these other Germanic tribes and Scandinavian tribes that precede them, we're looking for something that's here in Europe before all these other Central Asian peoples come in. And so this seems to fit this group I. There's a lot of branches here that are predating the Central Asian invasions. The last clue that I want to point to is just how far back this lineage goes. This connects to the other lineages in this tree in the pre-1000 BC era. So this may very well represent the lineage of some of the first peoples that were here in Europe and then eventually migrated to the Americas during the Age of Exploration. So it's not just 1500 years in Europe, it looks like it's even long before that. So it's an ancient lineage. So this, again, all this together checks these boxes and suggests itself as a good candidate for these lineages. Another clue to the possibility that this might be a Viking lineage, if not more than that, in Europe, is the geographic distribution of it and the concentration of it. So I said this is a primarily European lineage with echoes in the Americas, so we can strip away these other populations and try to graphically visualize where and how concentrated this lineage is in Europe and the Americas. And I'm going to change the colors for the American populations to reflect the fact that we're only going to look at the European descent among these peoples in the Americas. And I'm going to move over that French group to the Americas because this particular group was residing in the Americas, though they're of French descent. So what's the concentration of this group I in these various populations. Let's begin with the right side, the Finnish population. It's at 26%. And I'm drawing these circles in relative proportions to reflect the concentration so we can see at a glance where is this lineage located. In the British populations, it's around 15%. And again, these aren't hard, fast, absolute numbers. It'll depend somewhat on sampling. So it's 26%, maybe plus or minus 5%. It's around that area. The point is, when we look at and compare it to Southern Europe, Spain, Italy, Mediterranean groups, it's much more concentrated in Northern Europe versus Southern. It's only at a 4% level in Spain and in Italy. And consistent with this north-south gradient, France typically being more of a Northern European country than a Mediterranean one, these Utah residents of French descent also have this lineage at 24%. In Latin America, the Mexicans in Los Angeles, the Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico, the Colombians in Medellin, and the Peruvians in Lima, they have an average of about 5% in this lineage, which is consistent with what we discussed in previous episodes. The history of Latin America is somewhat different from the history of Caucasian America, I could say, of US and Canada. US especially is heavily influenced by massive numbers of Western Europeans migrating there. Latin America has much less absolute numbers of migration. It's more, and the geography is different. It's heavily Mediterranean Europe migrating to the Americas. It's fewer numbers, so it's some Europeans coming over and then multiplying in place. Whereas the US, it's more lots of people coming with some multiplication in place. And so this historical migration connection to Mediterranean Europe, I'd say, finds its echo in the genetic proportions in Latin America. The genetic proportion of this group I here reflects historically what it is here. Now I want to bring this Utah group back to Europe so we can get a closer look at this overall proportion. What I find fascinating here is the proportion of this I seems to reflect, at the moment, some of the major locations of Viking raiding and eventual settlement. Now notice here on this map that Iceland was heavily settled by the Vikings. There is an Icelandic study of the Y chromosome. This is the paper that I'm referring to. And the number of Icelanders today who have this group I ancestry is 38%. The last group I want to look at is the Russian settlement. Excuse me, there's two more groups I want to look at. One is Danish, the other one is Russian. Notice that the Danes are part of the Viking homeland, Scandinavian homeland. There is a Danish study that includes Y chromosome data, and they have a whopping 47% I ancestry. So it is much higher in Northern Europe, and especially the historical Scandinavian homelands of the Vikings compared to Southern Europe. So that is a very intriguing correlation. Here's now I want to bring in the Russians. This other study, we have to go to this one because it's a much heavier emphasis study of Eastern Europe versus Western Europe. We'll ignore all these other colors, just the yellow ones. There is a group I in this particular study, and on average, these Eastern Europeans have this group I lineage at a rate of 16%. Remember, of course, Eastern Europe is where you have subsequent, later, and heavy Central Asian migrations. So it's higher in Northern and Eastern Europe versus Southern Europe, which again seems to match, checks the boxes of the geography of the Viking realm and its rating, which is also very intriguing. But we're still left with a question. I've made these circles, their sizes, to reflect the relative proportions, but you'll notice in terms of absolute values, none of these circles, none of these percentages exceeds 50%. So I've drawn these massive circles, and yet it's still a minority of the lineages all across Europe. Why is that? Why is this ancestry so low? Why is Europe, and by extension the Americas, still so dominated by the Central Asian lineages? Well, let's think about the history of European population growth, the history of population growth and decline on the European continent. Again, it's got this hockey stick shape, which is fairly flat or gradual growth for a couple thousand years. Then it starts to go upward, then it drops, and then it has this massive shooting upward in the last few hundred years. I want to draw our attention to that brief downturn. The point where it starts going up is 1300. That nadir, the bottom of it is 1400. 1300s is when the Black Death strikes and decimates Europe. By some estimates, 25% to a third of Europe died out in the Black Death. What does this have to do with the Vikings? Where does the Black Death come from? Central Asia. That's the origin of this plague. Well, 1300s, mid 1300s is when it's ravaging Europe. 1200s is the Mongol conquests. And prior to that, we've seen in previous episodes, the Magyars, the Oghuz Turks, and some of these other Central Asian groups are prior to the Mongols. So I would argue, prior to the Black Death, we already have the ancestors, the major groups that I'm calling the R1b and R1a lineages present in Europe. You'll have to see episode 10 for a discussion of R1b, and some of the prior episodes for R1a, where I talked about R1a likely being the signature of the Mongol conquest, R1b likely coming from the Magyars or one of these other Central Asian groups. My point is, you have people of Central Asian descent already present in Europe before the Black Death strikes. What we've seen today is you also have a good candidate for Viking descent, if not more than that, Germanic tribes and so forth. The Goths and the Vikings might share a common heritage. All these groups are present prior to the striking of the Black Death. Well, in comes and in marches the Black Death from Central Asia and wipes out a third of Europe. Let's ask the question, does it wipe out peoples equally? When the Black Death ravages Europe, does it strike every person indiscriminately? Or could there be some built-in resistance to this, depending on who your ancestors were? We've talked about in previous episodes the lack of Native American resistance to European diseases, and that being a major factor in the decimation of these peoples after the arrival of Columbus. Could something similar have played out just a century or two prior in Europe? So what I'm suggesting that we consider is, if you're in Europe and you're in the R1b or R1a lineage, and somehow you, in your family tree, you've got these Central Asian ancestors, could that have contributed somehow a measure of immunological resistance or survival, or somehow an ability to make it through the Black Death? Whereas if you're of an indigenous European lineage, no genetic contribution from Central Asia, could you have been selectively decimated by this particular epidemic? So that by the 1800s, when people start moving en masse to the Americas, they're moving in these sorts of proportions, heavily R1b, some R1a, less so this I lineage, indigenous European lineage. Is this the reason why these Central Asian origin lineages are so dominant in Europe, and then by extension in the Americas today? Is it because of the Black Death? Is this low percentage of group I ancestry, an echo of the immunological history of Europe and the arrival of the Black Death? Is this depiction we've seen earlier of the various percentages in these groups, is this our chance of being of Viking ancestry? The clues we have so far all seem to point this direction. So next time, and in future episodes, we'll discuss more of the history of Europe and try to go back to the earliest stages. This is the new history of the human race, and there's so much more to discuss. This gives us a flavor as we've been working from the present backwards in time and seeing how the general rule of thumb that's emerging is last empire tends to win. Vikings are an earlier empire, later empires come in and tend to outcompete them. This is a rule of thumb we're going to see, not just in this episode, but in future ones going forward.
Wow, really fascinating, Nathaniel. So, hey, by the way, how tall are you?
About 5'11", not necessarily Swedish tall. I'm more German, French ancestry, but 5'11"-ish.
So I'm 6 foot, and I have sons that are 6'3" and 4. So that would mean we must have closer Viking ancestry, right?
That could very well be true. Yes. So this would extend, including to Australia, because of the heavy European influence there as well. We didn't discuss. I don't have data on hand at present to know the proportion of I ancestry in Australia, but my guess is it's going to be very similar to what we see in the Americas and in Europe.
Yeah, I felt, discriminated against because you sort of ignored Australia talking about the Vikings.
It was unintentional.
Oh, okay, all right. So the one tomorrow night on the Jews, tell us what you're going to do there.
Just to give a little tease, what we're going to see is the history of the Jews and of the Middle East in general is going to again be a question of last man standing. There have been many reports that have come out suggesting there is a Jewish lineage, and that's the question we want to explore. Can we go back to Moses and Aaron and King David? There's a long biblical history here. Is there an echo in the DNA of peoples today? We, of course, have the question of the genetic relationship between Jews and, to this day, their long-standing enemies in the Middle East, Arabs. Arabs would trace their ancestry back through Ishmael. Is there evidence for this blood connection in genetics? Is there more recent connections? These are some of the very large, massive questions that revolve around the Jews that we want to use genetics to address. So no controversy at all that we're going to discuss tomorrow night.
Oh, I can see that. Episode 18, can we identify the Jews genetically? That'll be the next episode 18, tomorrow night. Okay, we look forward to that. Thank you, Dr. Jensen.
Thank you.